Okay, so it's now 6:30 on the dot. So, the staff at the Centre for Lifelong Learning told me I should say a little bit about myself before I start. So, here we go. My name is David Worsley, and I'm technically a research assistant in the philosophy department here at York. However, I currently live in Dublin, and I work as the coordinator for both the Trinity College International Development Initiative and also for the Development Studies Association of Ireland. So I'm here today as an international speaker. I did my undergraduate degree here in PPE, as well as 2 master's degrees in political philosophy and philosophy, theology and ethics with David Efford. And 1 year after starting a PhD here, I married my wonderful wife, Laura, who's here today. And 2 weeks after that, Laura and I jetted off to China, where I spent the next 3.5 years teaching at an international school. So if you wonder why a lot of the anecdotes that will pepper this talk are about teaching, well, that's why. So my topic this evening is making amends, perspectives on shame and punishment. In essence, this talk is a more approachable take on part of my PhD thesis and borrows somewhat generously from a paper my PhD supervisor and I had published recently in the Philosophical Quarterly. I anticipate speaking for around 50 minutes, with time at the end, hopefully, for a Q&A moderated by my supervisor, David Efford. So if you want me to clarify anything I've said during this talk, or if you think I'm just plain wrong about something, please note down your objection, and hopefully I'll have a chance to answer your questions once I'm finished. So, the skeleton of this talk, if you will, is going to be centered around answering the following 3 questions. Firstly, what are we making when we make amends? Secondly, why should we make amends? And thirdly, how can we make amends? I'm going to take around 15 to 20 minutes on the first 2 questions, and then about 10 minutes on the last one. And then I'm going to conclude with some possible policy implications for what I've spoken on. For those of you keeping track of time, if you know what question I'm on, you'll know more or less how long I've got left to speak. And one final thing before I start, I'll start discussing shame as I unpack the second question, and then punishment as I unpack the third. So if in 20 minutes' time you find yourself wondering whether you've been shortchanged, given the title of my talk, please keep that judgment on hold for now. So, what are we making when we make amends? I want to begin with a true story. As I mentioned, a few years ago, my wife and I moved to China to teach at an international school there. Over the course of time, I decided to start a Model United Nations Club, or MUN Club, at the school. I had been to an MUN event when I was younger, and I thought the students at our school would benefit from attending one too. The club had received fairly positive feedback, so I decided to put us forward for a conference in a nearby city. As it turns out, this was not the small parochial event I had imagined. This was in fact one of the largest MUN competitions in China, with schools coming from all over Asia to attend. But it was on our front door, and I didn't realize that then. Now, a few facts. Our school was, as international schools go, quite small. And we were based in, as Chinese cities go, a fairly rural town. Certainly well away from the bigger Chinese cities like Beijing or Shanghai. Most of our students were from South Korea, and our school was not particularly selective in its admissions policy. Our students' English ranged from passable to essentially unintelligible, and it would have been an exaggeration to say they were relatively inexperienced at public speaking, let alone public speaking in English. But none of this fazed me at the time. The MUN event I had been to, way back when I was in secondary school, had seen 6 or 7 of my schoolmates serve as a single country's delegation, and then most of us didn't say anything at all. So it came as quite a surprise when, despite it being quite clear on my application that our MUN club only had 10 members, we were asked to put forward 10 delegations. Never fear, I thought. The weaker students can just listen to what's happening around them. The event I had been to previously hadn't forced participation, and I was certain this wouldn't either. Now, I think you can probably see where this is going. In my defense, I was not aware that in MUN circles there are two types of conferences. One where participation is entirely optional, which I had experienced, and one where it is strictly enforced. I'm sure I don't have to describe to you the faces of my panicked, barely literate MUN students as they were called upon one by one to address, in English, their respective forums of 100 plus of Asia's best and brightest English-speaking youths. Not just for 2-minute opening speeches, but also in the production of highly technical UN resolutions, and then in 3 days of enforced public debate with what would have been tantamount to next year's Ivy League cohorts. So, that's my story. What was the point of this anecdote? Well, my first point is this. Making amends requires a contrite public confession. And so there was mine. No, I'm just kidding. The point of the story is this. If we're going to do anything, anything, we need an idea or a concept of what whatever we're trying to do looks like. I thought I knew what I was getting my poor students into, but really, I did not. Just as I really should have known the form and format for this MUN conference before making preparations to attend, it would be prudent for us to know the form and format, the ideal, if you will, of what we want to be making when we make amends. So for the next few minutes, let's try looking at what this finished product might look like. So quite unashamedly, I'm going to be borrowing quite heavily from the 13th century philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas. I'm going to be doing this principally because I find his account to be both very persuasive and also quite profound, at least as I understand it. But I'm not going to defend my decision to do this in any great detail. So if you're thinking of objections, finding a reason to reject my take on Aquinas' account is going to be a pretty good one for you to pick up on. So, with this preamble out of the way, what could we be making when we make amends? Well, the word amends comes from the Latin ex, out of, and menda, which is blemish or fault. Free from blemish or free from fault. And my thesis is this. Making amends brings us back into proper relationships with other people and with society as a whole. Now, the key word in this claim is the word proper, and so my aim in the next few minutes will be to outline what I consider to constitute a proper relationship between persons, and then more generally, between persons and society as a whole. So, let's start with the following intuition about society, that Aquinas borrows from Aristotle. Okay. Aquinas says this. One who is separated from society so as to be completely apolitical must be either subhuman or superhuman. He must be either a beast or a god. So that's someone who's separated from society. So, a beast or a god. Well, nevertheless, Aquinas had his reasons for making this startling claim. Aquinas cites, for instance, the thought that natural human aspirations, like, for instance, honor or esteem, only make sense in the context of social groups. Honor and esteem are worthless to a man who lives on a desert island. So too, Aquinas thinks, becoming a virtuous person requires interaction with others. So think of it this way. The mere absence of vice does not entail that a person is virtuous. Our man on his desert island might not feel hatred for anyone else, but this does not make him virtuous. Rather, the virtuous individual is one who is good, or, despite good reason to the contrary, still forswears his hatred in favor of love. Furthermore, given the importance Aquinas places on education in becoming virtuous, at least some very minimally educationally based societal framework seems essential to the development of a person in the virtues. So because of this, and for many other reasons I don't want to explain here, Aquinas considered it much better for humans to live in social groups than to be alienated from them. And all the more, as he takes this sort of alienation to be amongst the worst things that could happen to a person. For Aquinas, then, the social groups we find ourselves in are founded on the twin pillars of justice and love. Now, Aquinas, of course, had his theological reasons for making these claims, but I'm not going to address them here. Neither, in fact, am I going to address Aquinas' account of justice. That is, besides mentioning that for Aquinas, justice essentially meant giving someone their due. Instead, I want to devote the next 5 or so minutes to unpacking Aquinas' account of love. I'm going to do this because I think it's in this account of love that we can find the glue that prevents alienation and that causes societies to cohere. And so, I claim, it's in examining exactly how love leads to cohesion that we can come to understand what a proper relationship might look like. So, what might a society grounded on love look like? Well, Aquinas makes 2 important qualifications regarding the nature of love that can help us answer this question. Firstly, Aquinas says that love has what we might call different offices. The love I have for my wife, for instance, is necessarily different from the love I might have for family, or for friends, or for humanity in general, and that I can't usefully compare the love that I have for my wife with that of my friends. What is appropriate in one office may be entirely inappropriate in another. So that's our first qualification. Love has different offices. And as an office is merely the function of the extrinsic relational characteristics of the lover and the beloved, so long as the different offices are clearly labelled, love has, in theory, a place in all our personal and group relations. Secondly, it's important to note that Aquinas views love as the function of 2 desires: the desire for the good of the beloved and the desire for union with the beloved. If you desire the good of someone and you desire the union of some sort with them, then according to Aquinas, you love them. But note here that what can be shared within an office of love is contingent, on the intrinsic features of the one that you love. The reason you love someone isn't because they share that office of love with you. I don't love my wife because she is my wife. There are other reasons. And so, what is in fact good for the beloved and the nature and extent of the union possible with the beloved might change with time, even if the office of love does not. So I'll dwell on this in a little bit more depth later, but for the moment, please take the following mental note. The genus of union that you desire ought to befit the office of love that you share with someone. But the species of love might alter within the genus in order to accommodate changes in the beloved. The genus of union desired in marriage is very different to the genus of union you might generally desire with humanity as a whole. It's different in depth, and it's different in scope. And that's fine. Continuing this taxonomic theme, it's all captured under what we might call the family of love. Now, given the cohesive importance I'm ascribing to love, I'm going to spend a bit more time unpacking its twin desires. So, desiring the good of the beloved seems relatively straightforward here. If you love someone, you want what is good for them. But note that what Aquinas is referring to here is an ultimate good, rather than a local or a temporal one. So here's one way to see the distinction at play. Imagine you're a school teacher. Class is almost over, and you're about to hand out homework to your students. Inevitably, they complain, "But teacher, I have other plans tonight. This is too much." And so on. Now, in one sense, it would be good for them not to have homework to do. They could get on and play their video games without distraction. Indeed, in one sense, it might be good for you not to give it. There'll be less marking for you to do. But in another sense, to refrain from giving them homework, and certainly from continuing to refrain from doing so, would run counter to the student's greatest good. That is, their development in the virtues, say temperance and prudence perhaps, and the reaching of their full academic potential. On Aquinas' account, therefore, desiring the good of the student would involve giving them homework. Now, it's interesting to note, but perhaps somewhat irrelevant to the topic at hand, that so long as this desire is actually for the beloved's ultimate good, not just to spite them, it is possible to reconcile certain kinds of what might appear to be prima facie hatred with species of love. Whilst it might appear prima facie that giving homework is a sign of hatred for your students, it could actually be a sign of love for them. So that's desiring the good of the beloved. Well, What about the desire for union with the beloved? Well, we can break union down into two kinds too. What we might call real union and what we might call formal union. I want to look at each in turn. So formal union consists in a union of minds. And by union of mind, I mean your knowledge on some basic level of what the other person is thinking and desiring. This is perhaps the basis for what we might call empathy. Now, for formal union to occur, there must be an element of personal closeness between one individual and another, where this mutual closeness is composed of some spoken or unspoken personal revelation of yourself, something of yourself to the other person, and where it is met by some personal need in the other, but note, a kind of need not due to a lack in them. It's not that I have a sort of a hole in my heart that only someone else can fill. No, it's a need for the person in their own right. So, some revelation must have occurred in order for you to know what's on another's mind. And you must have been willing and receptive to receive it. Self-revelation to someone who just doesn't care, someone who doesn't need you, will not lead to formal union. Neither, indeed, will needing someone, but refusing to reveal anything of yourself to them. Of course, what's appropriate to reveal will depend on the office of love. That is, the extrinsic relational characteristics shared between persons, and also on the intrinsic features of the beloved. The sort of union present in a strong marriage, then, will typically and quite appropriately require a more significant self-revelation than the union between mere acquaintances. Indeed, such significant self-revelation will be quite inappropriate between someone you find yourself, say, sitting next to in a lecture theatre. Now, before I move on, I want to add to this thought, mainly as I find it fascinating. Formal union is not necessarily reciprocal. You could receive a letter in the post from someone who has poured out their heart to you, and through this self-revelation on their behalf, you can come to some semblance of formal union with them. So too, in fact, it appears you can engage in formal union with well-written fictional characters as well. But I bring this up only to put it to one side again. In real union, to this mutual closeness is added what we might call significant personal presence. But note here that presence can mean several different things. A student could be asleep in class, and yet technically present in some minimal way. One of the biggest faux pas I committed as a teacher came when, after a fairly going history lesson, I discovered one of my pupils had fallen asleep. Quietly dismissing the rest of the class, I set the classroom clock forward several hours and slammed my classroom door. The poor girl awoke in a fright. Looking at the clock, she grabbed her bag, ran out into the corridor screaming about how she'd missed her bus home. Now, I learned a lesson that day about the emotional fragility of sensitive adolescents. But all joking aside, the girl was still recorded as having been present in my class. However, there is a kind of presence where one person is present to another in a way which is altogether more significant. Imagine two strangers sitting next to each other on a plane. In one version of events, the journey goes without a hitch. The two make small talk, but leave as at best acquaintances. Their conversation was detached. They were present to each other, but not significantly. Now, in another version of events, they're sitting next to each other, but the plane suffers catastrophic engine failure. The captain informs the passengers of this fact, and not wanting to die alone, they reach out to one another. Miraculously now, the plane lands safely, and the two once strangers part as friends. This is an intuition I think we could all find. In the former case, the two were perhaps minimally present. In the latter, they were certainly significantly so. So in philosopher speak, this sort of significant presence is described as involving a second personal encounter with the other, an encounter with both unmediated causal and cognitive contact, and also what we call dyadic joint attention. That is the idea that you're focusing on me, and you know that I'm focusing on you, and you know that I'm focusing on you, focusing on me, focusing on you, and so on. Now, inasmuch as real union requires significant personal presence, it is unlike formal union, for it thereby also requires reciprocity. In whatever office it's found, unrequited love can have some measure or fulfillment through formal union. But the real union that unrequited love desires cannot be fulfilled without both a reciprocal desire from the beloved and the opportunity for dyadic joint attention. So, with these qualifications in hand, where does that leave us? Well, let me put the following to you. Certainly in Aquinas' ideal society, and perhaps in ours too, we would in fact love each other as is befitting the office of love that we share with each member of our society. We would desire the ultimate good for each member, that is, that we all become perfected in the virtues, not that we become millionaires. And we would desire at least some sense of formal union, opening ourselves up maybe to the prospect of real union also with others, as once again befits the office of love that we share. So that's our ideal. That's the finished product, if you will. These twin desires, the desire for the good of the beloved and the desire for union with the other, are the glue, perhaps, that I was talking about earlier. So this is, then, what we are making when we make amends. Okay, so why should we make amends? Now, I'm going to presume that if... Oops, get that one. I'm going to assume that if we're all appropriately exercising the twin desires of love, no amends needs to be made, for already we are in Aquinas' ideal society. But of course, the real world seems a long way away from that ideal. So in order to address why we should make amends, we first need some explanation for how amends become necessary. Again, for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to assert that some form of relational damage occurs when we act towards someone in a manner contrary to the twin desires of love. In a few minutes, I'm going to address the form this relational damage might take. However, before I do this, I think it will prove prudent to say a few things about the nature of desire itself. So, desires, I think, can be qualified in at least two ways. Here's the first qualification. A desire can be freely willed, or it can be in some sense involuntarily willed. And a desire freely willed is more serious than one which is involuntarily willed. That's our first qualification. Our second qualification is this. Desires can conflict. Where a person has conflicting desires, these conflicting desires prevent the person from acting wholeheartedly, and can also cause what we call maybe psychic fragmentation in that person. Simply put, if part of you wants to walk out of this lecture theatre, and yet, perhaps out of pity, some small part of you wants to stay, whatever you do, some part of you is going to be dissatisfied. Okay? So, those are our two qualifications. So how do these two qualifications help clarify why amends should be made? Well, I'm going to claim that desire for union with another person is a special sort of desire. I'm going to claim that it should be both freely willed and, as much as is possible, wholeheartedly willed also. To the extent that union is not wholeheartedly willed, to that same extent does a part of you not want to unite with the other person. And so to that extent will union fall short of what it could be. Similarly, to the extent that union is not freely willed, to that extent, whatever union obtains is at least worse than it could otherwise have been. Less serious. And finally, as I'm going to now attempt to explore, to the extent that union is not wholeheartedly desired, it is also not freely willed. If you have one problem, you have both. So to defend this claim, I'm going to briefly introduce an account of what constitutes a freely willed action. I do this, as I did with Aquinas' account of love, because I happen to find it persuasive. But again, if you're keeping track of possible objections, the following position is by no means unanimously accepted. So here we go. The will, says the philosopher Harry Frankfurt, has a hierarchical structure. We have first-order desires and second-order desires, and so on. According to Frankfurt, acting with freedom of the will involves acting at least on a second-order desire. That is, doing what one wants to want to do. If one doesn't do what one wants to want to do, then one did not act freely, and therefore one does not have freedom of the will. So here's how Frankfurt explains it. Frankfurt calls a person who can't do what they want to do a wanton, akin perhaps to someone addicted to alcohol or drugs who wants to stop. They want to stop, but they find they actually cannot. The wanton retains moral responsibility for their actions. Nevertheless, they do not act freely in this sense of a free act. They're not doing what they want to do. Okay? So what happens when one wants to do two conflicting things? Well, so says Frankfurt, in this case, a person will only act with freedom of the will if they act on an unconflicted third-order desire. That is, they do what they want to do. This sort of hierarchy regresses until one can wholeheartedly commit to or identify with one particular course of action. Now, the philosopher Robert Keynes summarizes this position as follows. Persons are wholehearted when there are no conflicts in their wills at the various levels of desires, and they are not ambivalent about what they want to do. Ambivalent persons, by contrast, are of two or more minds about what they want to do, and they cannot make up their minds. So, if we adopt Frankfurt's account, for us to have the sort of serious union we want, our desire for union should be freely willed. And to be freely willed, it must be wholeheartedly desired. So with this qualification of desire lodged in the back of our minds, let's look again at how relational damage might occur. In the previous section, I said that the glue that binds relationships together is essentially a product of a desire for the good of the other and a desire for union with the other. So what happens to a relationship when a person does something that clearly communicates the negation of one or both of these desires? Well, in a seminal book, Making Amends, Atonement in Morality, Law and Politics, Linda Radzik argues that wrongdoing does just this. Wrongdoing, she says, necessarily communicates some element of disrespect towards the victim. Here's what she says. So a large part of what is wrong with wrongdoing is that it is disrespectful to the victims. Now, Radzik has a whole other story about how in wronging a person, the wrongdoer elevates themselves and the importance of their own agency above the victim. But again, for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to assume that she's right. Fitting Radzik's thought then into Aquinas' account of love, I suggest that this communication of disrespect carries with it the communication in some sense of a desire both for what is bad for the victim and also a desire for separation from them. Furthermore, until this communication is removed, its content continues to be broadcast, uninterrupted, into the future. So here's an easy way of looking at that. If you were to tell me or show me that you think I'm worthless, that you do not want union with me in any sense, until you do something that clearly retracts this claim, it's reasonable for me to believe that you still endorse those sentiments. I think it's reasonable to believe that this is the case 5 minutes after you make that claim, that you show me that way, as it is 2 days or perhaps a year afterwards as well. So what happens next? Well, there are two directions we could take here. The better trodden path involves investigating the quite warranted feelings of anger and resentment that might be felt by the victim. In philosopher speak, the victim's reactive attitudes. An easy response would be to say that whilst the relationship between the victim and wrongdoer was initially damaged by the wrongdoer's communication of disrespect, the ensuing damage is caused by the victim. It's the victim now who refuses to see the wrongdoer as an equal. It's the victim who refuses any sort of union with the wrongdoer. It's the victim who demands vengeance, who demands what is bad for the wrongdoer, and so on. Again, a simple thought experiment can capture this idea. You might have seen a recent story in the news about a maid who had her arm unjustly amputated by her employer. For the moment, put yourself in the mind of this maid, in formal union with her, if you will. Now, it seems for all the world like she has a very good reason never to want to see her employer again, never to want to even think about them again, let alone desire any kind of union with them. However, I think it's short-sighted to categorize the damage that wrongdoing causes to a relationship in this way alone, that is, of the victim's rejection of the wrongdoer. I don't want to deny the evident fact that if the relationship between the maid and employer is to be in any way restored, the maid will have to forswear her quite reasonable resentment. That is, she'll have to find a way to forgive her previous employer. However, it would be naive to think that the relationship will be restored immediately upon her forgiveness. Now, inasmuch as the maid has a very good reason to refuse future union with her previous employer, or to want what is bad for her previous employer, it is also appropriate for her to desire both separation from and what is bad for this person. Now, reflection on the appropriateness of these desires, I will now argue, should cause the wrongdoer, the employer, to feel certain reactive attitudes too, namely, the self-reflexive reattitudes of guilt and of shame. Now, guilt and shame are both tremendously complex emotions and are in many respects ill-suited to simple explanations or pigeonholing. Nevertheless, in the interest of brevity, I'm going to attempt to do just that. Or more properly, I'm going to use someone else's definitions. So, the philosopher Eleanor Stump distinguishes guilt and shame, when they're found together, in more or less the following way. For Stump, guilt involves the belief that it is appropriate for another to desire what is bad for you. That's what guilt is for Eleanor Stump. And shame involves the belief that it is appropriate for another to desire to reject you as a person. Now, as befits the complexity of these emotions, Stump makes it clear that it's not a hard and fast definition, that it's often very difficult to isolate guilt from shame. Nevertheless, with this qualification in mind, it seems fairly apparent that on Stump's definitions, guilt and shame broadly mirror the twin desires for love that I earlier argued constitute the glue that binds personal relationships and societies together. And indeed, Stump makes this very same connection. A guilty person, she says, anticipates anger on the part of real or imagined others, and so he is anxious about things others may reasonably want to impose on him that are punishments, and in their view are not for his good in some sense of good. His concern, therefore, that real or imagined others will lack for him the first desire of love, the desire for the good for him as he sees it. By contrast, the shamed person anticipates warranted rejection or abandonment on the part of real or imagined others, and so he is anxious about marginalization or isolation. His anxiety is directed toward a distance and absence of union forced on him by others with whom he himself desires some kind of closeness. His worry is, therefore, that real or imagined others will lack for him the second desire of love, the desire for union with him. Now, I'm going to argue that whilst it remains appropriate for your victim to desire what is bad for you, and whilst it remains appropriate that your victim desires to reject you as a person, your reflection on this appropriateness will inevitably produce in you the reactive attitudes, the self-reflexive reactive attitudes of guilt and shame. And these feelings of guilt and shame will inevitably cause psychic fragmentation. To the extent that the wrongdoer feels guilt, to that same extent is at least part of them unable to desire what is good in the victim, that is, that they, the wrongdoer, are punished. Likewise, to the extent a wrongdoer feels shame, that is, that they think it's appropriate that the other desires to reject them, to that same extent are they themselves divided in their own mind, internally fragmented between the part they are shamed by and the part that identifies with the shame. And on that level, they are incapable of union with their victim. And often, in view of their negative self-image about themselves, they're incapable of union with third parties also. So, here's Stump again, recasting what I've said. A shamed person is divided into the self that is shamed and the self that has internalized the standards giving rise to the feeling of shamed. A shamed person's repudiation of himself as ugly or otherwise understandably rejected is as effective as the inner dividedness generated by moral wrongdoing at preventing or undermining union, closeness, and love. Furthermore, a shamed person is not merely internally fragmented. It's not merely the case they've got psychic fragmentation going on. They're not only not close with themselves, they also often wish to physically hide themselves from their victim. This belief that the other could appropriately reject them is, Stump writes, surely at least part of the reason why a person suffering from shame wants not to be seen. He supposes that if he were seen, others would be justified in rejecting him. That is why shame is characterized by a desire to avoid the gaze of others, to be invisible. Now, it's interesting to note that not even the victim's complete forgiveness can remove the appropriateness of their rejecting the person who has wronged them, or the appropriateness of their desiring what is bad for them. The appropriateness of this state of affairs is not changed by the victim's actual feelings, any more than the appropriateness of my giving homework is changed by the indifferent attitudes of myself, my students, the school, or the student's parents. The problem with guilt and shame, then, is this. At every point on Frankfurt's hierarchy of the will, reflection on the appropriateness of the other's rejection, and so on, will cause part of you to want to shy away from your victim and cause part of you to be alienated from yourself. If one feels guilt or shame, wholeheartedly desiring union with the one you think can appropriately reject you, etc., is therefore impossible. Stump describes this state in the following way. The presence of guilt and shame, she says, tend toward alienation and a state of willed loneliness. In the same way that resentment can damage the relationship the victim shares with the wrongdoer, so too does guilt and shame damage the relationship the wrongdoer might share with their victim. So if we're to meet the ideal that I set out earlier, if we're to aspire to this ideal society where we share proper relationships with others, dealing with the guilt and shame caused by wrongdoing is just as important as dealing with the victim's resentment, if not more so. As I mentioned earlier, forgiveness cannot remove the appropriateness of rejection. And so although forgiveness is necessary in restoring proper relationships, inasmuch as forgiveness cannot deal with guilt and shame, it is not sufficient for the restoration of these proper relationships. In the next and final section, I want to explore how guilt and shame can be overcome. And as you might expect, given the title of this talk, I will suggest the only way they can be resolved is through the making of some sort of amends. So, I began this section with a question. Why should amends be made? I now answer as follows. Given the importance of proper relationships and the badness of alienation and willed loneliness, amends should be made where the guilt and shame associated with wrongdoing renders proper relationships impossible, and where this same guilt and shame can only be overcome in the making of amends. So that was section 2. Section 3, how can we make amends? Now, I concluded the previous section by saying that amends must be made if proper relationships are to be restored after wrongdoing. In this section, I want to explore how amends might be made, given our understanding of the problem posed by the wrongdoer's guilt and shame. I've already touched on the role the victim can play in this process of reconciliation, the forswearing of their resentment through forgiveness. However, I noted that forgiveness does not remove the appropriateness of their rejection, nor does it remove the appropriateness of some reparative hard treatment being extracted from the wrongdoer through punishment or through some voluntary offering. And this is even the case if the victim makes it very clear they've elected not to reject their wrongdoer, and they are not interested in the wrongdoer's repayment. Neither of those state of affairs affect the appropriateness of the wrongdoer's feelings. Now, before I begin to unpack how we might make amends, let's recap the way in which I've framed the problem so far. I began by saying that it is good to be in relationships and bad not to be. I said that relationships are based on love, where love is the function of two desires, the desire for the good of the other and the desire for union with the other. I then said that wrongdoing causes relational damage between victim and wrongdoer. And inasmuch as wrongdoing communicates a desire both for what is bad for the victim and separation from them, wrongdoing communicates disrespect to the victim. After this communication, I said it is appropriate for the victim now to desire what is, in some sense, bad for the wrongdoer, and also appropriate for the victim to reject the wrongdoer as a person. I concluded with the thought that reflection on the appropriateness of these desires, regardless of whether or not these desires are actualized in the victim, is sufficient to cause guilt and shame in the wrongdoer, and that unless dealt with, guilt and shame will inevitably eventuate in the wrongdoer's alienation and willed loneliness. So on this story, any satisfactory account of amends must show how the guilt and shame of the wrongdoer is dealt with. So how can we start this process? Well, to me, the obvious place to start involves the wrongdoer removing and replacing their initial communication of disrespect. But how can this be done? Well, Linda Radzik offers some suggestions. Making amends, she says, has 3 sub-goals. These are the objectives that must be made in order to merit any sort of reconciliation. First, The wrongdoer must morally improve herself. It is not enough to convince herself and others she is trustworthy. She must actually become trustworthy. Second, the wrongdoer must communicate with the victim, and in some case the community, in a way that withdraws the insult and the threat that the wrongful act expressed. Third, the wrongdoer must make reparations for the various sort of harm she created. In the standard cases of wrongs committed against others, all of these sub-goals must be met if the wrongdoer is to count as meriting reconciliation. Now, the idea goes something like this. If the wrongdoer is to withdraw the communication of disrespect implicit in their wrongdoing, they will have to offer an apology. But not just any old apology will suffice. The apology has to make clear their new and improved estimation of their victim, and most importantly, the apology must be sincere. There are, as I see it, two ways we can ground the sincerity of an apology, and each way involves raising your own trustworthiness. The first way is through what we might call repentance. If I steal something from you and then apologize, but turn around and steal something from you again almost immediately afterwards, it's quite evident my apology will do little to remove the initial communication of disrespect. If anything, my evidently insincere apology will reinforce the initial communication and likely make it worse. The second way applies only in cases where repentance alone is insufficient to ground the sincerity of an apology. Think back to the example I gave you of the amputee maid. If her previous employers came back to her and said something like, "Look, we're really sorry, but we promise we won't do it again," would that really sufficiently ground the sincerity of their apology? I have serious doubts that it would. In this case, then, repentance is not enough to ground the sincerity of an apology. Instead, I suggest that something above and beyond what is required by justice has to be added to repentance and apology. We may call this supererogatory action penance. In the case of the maid, her previous employers could ground the sincerity of their apology in something not required by justice, something that is suitably costly to themselves, that is also acceptable in the eyes of the maid. Of course, sending flowers and chocolates probably won't suffice. Whilst these gifts might, in someone's thinking, be construed as supererogatory, these trivial gifts cost those who wrong her very little, and I suspect are quite unlikely to cause the maid to trust in the sincerity of her previous employer's apology. Now, for time, I won't dwell any further on what might constitute suitable penance in such a scenario, or indeed whether suitable penance is even possible, given what has transpired. Nevertheless, I think the acceptable offering of a sincere apology, if such a sincere apology were possible, would be sufficient to remove and replace the communication of disrespect caused by the initial wrongdoing. So where might this fit into our account of shame and guilt? Well, on the account of both shame and guilt I discussed earlier, shame remained entirely a relational problem, whilst guilt was the concern of justice. That is, paying what is appropriately owed. Given this, I put to you that a sincere apology can deal with shame. Once sincerely offered, with all that entails, I suggest that it's no longer appropriate for the victim to desire to reject the wrongdoer as a person, although of course they may still do so. And I think if you cannot see how this could be the case, then perhaps you misunderstand how difficult it can be to offer an acceptably sincere apology. Again, it involves far more than just the words of apology uttered. So that is how, in starting the process of making amends, we might deal with shame. But what about guilt? Note that even if the maid's previous employers did find a way to offer her a sincere apology, justice demands that they also pay her some reparative payment. On Aquinas' account, this would be akin to an arm for an arm, only perhaps worked out in financial rather than corporal terms. Whilst these reparations remained unpaid, it would still be appropriate for her employer to feel guilt over what they had done. It would remain appropriate for the maid to demand that justice was done. Now, to be clear, I don't mean to imply that her employer can't feel guilt after paying reparative damages, merely that it will be inappropriate for them to feel so. Remember, guilt is the belief that it's appropriate for another to desire what is in some sense bad for you, That is, some punishment for you. If you have paid that punishment, it is no longer appropriate for you to pay it again. So perhaps this is how we might deal with guilt. So, how can we make amends? Or how do we make amends, sorry? This was the question I set myself at the start of this section. Well, I think I can now offer an answer. We can make amends for our wrongdoing by offering a sincere apology and by making satisfactory reparations. In doing the former, we can overcome shame, whilst in doing the latter, we can deal with our guilt. Upon doing so, it is possible for us to re-enter into proper relationships with those we have wronged, and therefore with society as a whole. Now, this being said, I want to take a moment to look at some real-world implications of this admittedly quite theoretical account. In the abstract for this talk, I name-dropped the increasingly popular notion of restorative justice. As it happens, I find the ideas behind restorative justice very laudable, namely, the idea we should focus on the needs of the victims and the offenders, rather than on satisfying perhaps abstract legal principles. Nevertheless, I'm concerned that unless we have a clear picture of how to restore someone back into society, that is to say, on the account I've just presented to you, how we can help a person deal with the guilt and shame caused by their wrong actions, restorative justice will not live up to its promise, and the hard-earned goodwill many people currently have toward it will be lost. In the little time I have left, I'm not sure I can give you anything that would do restorative justice justice. However, if you found the account I've given you a plausible one, I want to leave for your consideration 3 ideas. So, my first idea is this. Note that on the account I presented, a sincere apology cannot be forcibly extracted from someone. Whilst I was in China, I could certainly induce a student to say something along the lines of, "I'm sorry, I won't do that again," but I've suggested that that sort of an apology does not actually remove the communication of disrespect caused by the wrongdoing, and so it cannot be used to overcome shame. It's my opinion that any attempt at restorative justice that uses force to deal with shame will fail. But this is not to say that nothing can be done. It remains possible for you, the victim, to forgive the wrongdoer, to forswear any resentment toward them, and in doing so, make yourself open to at least some sense of formal union with them. Practically, a victim who has forgiven their wrongdoer can encourage the wrongdoer to apologize. They can refrain from making a sincere apology any harder on their pride than it might already be. Furthermore, if the wrongdoer has seriously wronged you and you feel particularly charitable, you can make it quite obvious what sort of a penance would be suitable. Nothing too extreme and nothing too easy. Or perhaps even, as either an individual or a society, provide an opportunity for the wrongdoer to offer this supererogatory penance. So that's my first thought. My second thought is this. Note that reparations can be forcibly extracted from a wrongdoer. As reparations involve giving someone their due, and this just is Aquinas' definition of justice, it seems not to matter how this due is given for the requirements of justice to be satisfied. Justice is, in this case, very much blind. Of course, in a perfect world, people would voluntarily make reparations for the wrong they have caused. However, as has been stressed throughout this talk, we do not live in a perfect world. In the case of someone who is reluctant to pay, or who cannot pay on their own, if that person is to be restored to society, that is, if their guilt is to be dealt with, somehow they must make their reparative payments. The unfortunate alternative, I think, at least on the account I presented to you, is their eventual slide into alienation and world loneliness. So in the case of someone who bears guilt, put my own sheet down. So for the case of someone who bears guilt, whilst these reparations remain unpaid, it would still be appropriate. I managed to lose my last sheet of paper. So, Yeah, in the case of someone who's reluctant to pay and who cannot pay on their own, if that person is to be restored to society, that is, if their guilt is to be dealt with, somehow they must make their reparative payments. The unfortunate alternative, on the story I've given you, is their eventual slide into alienation and willed loneliness. In the case of someone who bears guilt for their wrongdoing, the loving thing to do is to encourage, or to extract, perhaps as gently as possible, but even so, when necessary with legal force, appropriate reparations from them. If this takes the form of punishment, obviously determined and administered by the appropriate authority, then it would seem, even on a restorative account of justice, so be it. Finally, and with the previous 2 points in mind, it's my belief that a satisfactory account of restorative justice must know its limits. It must be aware of what society can do to help restore an individual, and it must be aware of what only an individual alone can do for themselves. Furthermore, a satisfactory account of restorative justice must not be too soft, and it must not shy away from the possibility of punishment. Restoration might prove painful, both to those extracting what is due and to those for whom the due is extracted, but the alternative is, at least according to Aquinas, far, far worse. So, there we go. That's my piece.